All right, welcome back, everyone. We're diving right back in, picking up where we left off last time. If you remember, things got pretty interesting with those tariffs.
Yeah, that's an understatement. A lot has happened since that April 2nd announcement. So this time we're going deeper, looking at how everybody's reacting, especially the US, China, and of course, Taiwan.
Right. And because it's so important to so many of you out there, we're going to zero in on what all of this means for Taiwan's businesses, particularly those SMEs, and for anyone in Taiwan thinking about their investments.
Absolutely, that's the real world impact. So to do that, we've got a whole bunch of new information to sift through. We're talking the 2025-0411 Grok update, the 2025-0411 update Gemini, and the 2025-0411 update P.
Plus, we've got some more specific stuff from Grok, focusing on what this means for investors in Taiwan and breaking down those U.S. tariffs. And to round it all out, we'll be checking in with OpenAI and Perplexity to see what they're saying. Should be a good one.
Definitely. Okay, quick recap for anyone who might have missed the last deep dive. April 2nd, that's when it all kicked off. Reciprocal tariffs announced, starting with a 10% baseline on everything coming into the U.S.
Right, 10% on everything. But then it got more targeted depending on the trade deficit with each country. So you had China hit with 34%, the EU at 20%, Japan at 24%, South Korea at 25%, Vietnam, while 46%, then Switzerland at 31%, and Taiwan at 32%.
And let's not forget that extra 25% on all those imported cars. It was supposed to all go live on April 9th. A lot of people were holding their breath.
But then April 9th rolls around and, surprise, things take a bit of a turn. Most of those new tariffs, they get put on hold for 90 days. That's 57 countries, including some big names like the EU and Japan.
Big sigh of relief, you'd think. But hold on, there's a twist. Tariffs on China. They didn't get a break. Instead, they went through the roof. We're talking a jump to 125%. Then, by April 10th, factoring in what was already there, it hits a whopping 145%.
Yeah, no kidding. And Canada and Mexico, they stayed at 25%. Same with the existing tariffs on steel and aluminum, still at 25%. So things are shifting, but not for everyone in the same way.
And the world definitely noticed. It wasn't pretty. You had Canada's Prime Minister Carney straight up accusing the U.S. of turning its back on, working together in the global economy. And countermeasures, they were on the table immediately.
Not surprising. And China, well, they were facing this huge 145% tariff, so naturally they weren't just going to sit back and take it. They made it clear they were going to hit back, even suggesting they might limit those rare earth exports, the ones everybody needs for tech, plus possible sanctions against 27 U.S. companies.
It was a global reaction, though. EU President Macron called the whole thing a shock to the system, suggested maybe hitting pause on U.S. investments. They were considering countermeasures too, but figured they'd try talking first.
Right. A lot of folks were watching to see what would happen. Over in Japan, Prime Minister Ishiba was calling it a national crisis. And the Japanese stock market, man, that took a beating. Its worst week in 5 years.
Yeah, and South Korea's acting president, Han Duck-soo, wasn't taking any chances either. Emergency task force, all hands on deck. They were going to throw everything they had at this. Even the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, their president, Georgieva, she was warning about a major risk to the whole global economic outlook.
Wow, so not just a little ripple in the pond, more like a tidal wave. And the markets definitely felt the tremors. Back on April 2nd, when the first tariff news dropped, you saw those stock markets take a dive. Dow Jones down almost 4%. The NASDAQ, even worse, almost 6%.
And big companies, the ones people really know, Nike, Apple, they took a hit too. I guess folks were worried about the supply chains getting messed up and Chinese consumers not buying as much. Made sense that investors started piling into those U.S. Treasury bonds, classic safe haven when things get rocky.
Yeah, makes sense. Then, April 9th, when they announced that 90-day pause for most countries, you could almost hear the markets breathe a sigh of relief. The S&P 500, that shot up 9.5%. The Dow, almost 3,000 points. And the NASDAQ, up a huge 12.2%.
A nice little rally, but let's be honest, it was short-lived. By the next day, April 10th, it was back down to reality. S&P 500, down 3.5%. NASDAQ, down 4.5%.
So, what happened? I thought things were supposed to be calming down.
Well, I think it finally sunk in that even with the pause, that 10% baseline tariff was still there for most countries. Plus, those escalated tariffs on China, they were a big deal. The uncertainty hadn't really gone away.
Ah, right. And speaking of China, that whole trade situation between them and the U.S., that was already pretty tense. But these new tariffs that just poured gasoline on the fire, it was like a back and forth, each side trying to one-up the other. Before that April 9th announcement even happened, on April 8th, the U.S. had already raised tariffs on China from 34% to 84%. They said it was a direct response to China's threats to retaliate.
And China, as expected, they matched it, raising their tariffs on U.S. goods to 84% too.
Tit for tat. But then the U.S. went even further, bumping those tariffs on China up to 125%, then 145%. They basically said it was because China was fighting back and, well, they weren't being respectful enough in the whole trade dispute. It was escalating fast.
Fast and furious. It wasn't just China feeling the heat, though. Those initial tariff threats, they put a strain on the U.S.'s relationships with its allies, too. We're talking the EU, Japan, South Korea, even Taiwan, even though they got that semiconductor exemption.
Yeah, we'll get to that exemption in a bit. But even with the 90-day pause, things were definitely shaken up. I mean, that 10% baseline tariff was still hanging over everyone except Canada and Mexico.
Yeah.
You can't just threaten everyone with tariffs and then expect them to forget about it.
Exactly. And it raised some big questions about, the rules of the game. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, they've got this thing called the Most Favored Nation Rule, MFN. It basically means you can't play favorites with your trading partners. If you give a break to one, you have to give it to everyone else.
Makes sense. So how did the U.S. justify all of this?
They were leaning on those national security exceptions. Their argument was that trade deficits weaken U.S. manufacturing, which in turn weakens national defense. So they said these tariffs were necessary to protect national security.
Interesting. But I bet not everyone was buying that argument.
Definitely not. A lot of WTO members weren't convinced at all. In theory, they could file complaints and try to get things resolved through the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism. But there's a catch. That system is kind of broken right now because the U.S. has been blocking the appointment of new judges. So the usual way of sorting out trade disputes, not really an option right now.
Okay, so a bit of a stalemate on that front. Let's shift gears and focus specifically on Taiwan. They were initially looking at a 32% tariff, but thankfully semiconductors got a pass.
Yeah, that semiconductor exemption was huge for Taiwan. After all, about a quarter of all their exports go to the U.S. But even without semiconductors getting hit, that 32% tariff, that would have hurt a lot of other industries.
Definitely. And our sources tell us that after those tariff announcements, Taiwan's 2025 GDP growth forecast took a hit. Before the tariffs, they were expecting growth between 3.14% and 3.42%. Now they're saying it'll likely be under 3%, some even saying as low as 2%. That's a big drop.
No kidding. So let's break it down. Besides semiconductors, which sectors were feeling the most heat?
Yeah, good question. What did our sources say?
Well, first off, non-semiconductor electronics, plastics, and textiles, they were bracing for impact. That 32% tariff would have hit them hard. And here's a kicker. Those AI servers and graphics card parts, Taiwan's big exporters, those weren't exempt. Even though they're tech, they didn't count as semiconductors for this.
Oh, wow. That's a big deal.
It is. Then you had the automotive industry facing that separate 25% tariff on cars and parts. Ouch. And the machinery and machine tool folks, they were worried about losing ground to competitors in, say, Japan and Germany, especially with that 32% tariff making them less competitive.
So a lot of pressure across the board.
Yeah, pretty much. Even traditional industries like golf equipment, bicycles, furniture, those kinds of things, they were feeling the squeeze too.
Wow, a lot to take in. So what did Taiwan do? How did they respond to all of this?
They were proactive. The government stepped in with a big financial assistance package, NT $880 billion, specifically for industries hit by the tariffs, especially electronics and steel.
That's a good chunk of change.
It is. Then you had the FSC, the Financial Supervisory Commission. They're like the financial watchdog in Taiwan. When the stock market took a nosedive, almost 10% on April 7th, they went into action.
I bet they did.
They put temporary limits on short selling, so people couldn't just bet against stocks and drive the market down further. They also made investors put up more money for trading, raise those margin requirements to try to cool things down.
Smart move.
Yeah, they were even talking about maybe using the National Stabilization Fund, the NSF. That's like their emergency fund to prop up the market if things get really bad. And on the political side, President La Ching-te called the tariffs unreasonable and said they'd try to negotiate with the U.S. to get rid of them. But he also said Taiwan wouldn't retaliate with its own tariffs.
So trying to find a middle ground, keeping things from getting even worse?
Exactly. It was a delicate balancing act.
It makes you wonder what all of this means for the average business owner in Taiwan, especially those small and medium enterprises, the SMEs. What are they up against?
For them, it's tough. They're not like big corporations with deep pockets. Even that 32% tariff, before it got dropped to 10% with the pause, that could wipe out their profits, especially when competing in the U.S. market.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Usually when tariffs hit, companies try to move production somewhere else where it's cheaper, like Southeast Asia. But this time, a lot of those countries were also facing tariffs, at least initially. So that escape route wasn't really open.
So what were they supposed to do? Just sit there and take it?
Luckily, some folks were offering advice. KPMG, they're a big consulting firm, they had some recommendations.
Okay, what do they say?
First, they said, gather your data, figure out exactly how these tariffs are going to hit you, where your weak points are in your supply chain and sales. Then, look for any loopholes, any tax breaks or programs in the U.S. that could help you lower those tariffs. And finally, be flexible. Don't be afraid to change your business plan. Adapt to the new situation, maybe find new markets or suppliers.
Good advice. It's all about staying agile.
Absolutely.
So what about individual investors in Taiwan? What were they supposed to do with all this uncertainty?
Well, our sources, Gemini and Grok TW Investment, they had some ideas. First, they said, stick with what you know, and in Taiwan, that means semiconductors and tech. Companies like TSMC, those were the darlings. Analysts were giving them strong buy ratings, saying their stock price could keep going up. They even mentioned a 12-month target around $232.05 USD.
That's a pretty good return.
It is. The logic was that TSMC is so important for those AI chips everyone's talking about, and they're expanding in the US, so they're well positioned. They also said to diversify within tech, maybe look at media tech or some tech ETFs to spread the risk.
Makes sense. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right. But they also said to balance things out with some safer investments. Consumer staples, like food and beverage companies, those are usually pretty steady. And healthcare, that's another good option, especially with Taiwan's aging population and the government spending more on healthcare.
So finding that balance between growth and stability.
Exactly. They even mentioned some specific companies like Unipresident and Lianhua Foods, or even high-dividend ETFs that focus on those sectors. But they also said to be careful with utilities. There's a lot of uncertainty with those and how energy policies are changing.
Okay, good to know. So a mix of tech, consumer staples, and healthcare with a side of caution on utilities. What about managing risk in general? What were they saying about that?
Risk management, that was huge. They said diversify, diversify, diversify. Don't just stick to one sector or one type of investment. ETFs were a big recommendation again, a good way to spread the risk.
Makes sense.
And they said keep an eye on those currency exchanges. You know, with all this going on, the US dollar, the Taiwan dollar, they could fluctuate a lot. And of course, those geopolitical risks, the tension between the US and China, the situation in the Taiwan Strait, those are all wild cards.
Yeah, you can't ignore those.
Definitely not. To protect against currency swings, they suggested hedging your bets, or even investing in TSMC's ADRs. Those are shares of a foreign company that trade on U.S. stock exchanges, so they're in U.S. dollars.
So taking some precautions to weather the storm?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay.
And they said, yeah, there might be some quick money to be made with all this volatility, but be careful. Short-term trading, that's risky business unless you really know what you're doing.
So the overall message for investors was be smart, be cautious, and don't panic.
Exactly. Don't let fear drive your decisions.
What about the big picture, though? What was the outlook for the Taiwanese stock market and companies in general?
They were expecting a hit to corporate earnings, somewhere between 5% and 8% lower because of those tariffs. And they were watching the TAIEX index closely. That's the main stock market index in Taiwan. They said that 18,600 to 19,500 point range, that was a key area to watch, kind of a support level.
So some potential trouble spots to keep an eye on.
Right. But there was also some good news. They said sectors with strong domestic demand, like telecoms, convenience stores, those kinds of things, they might actually do okay. People still need to buy groceries and make phone calls no matter what's happening with international trade.
Makes sense. So a mixed bag overall, some winners, some losers.
Pretty much. This whole situation, it's complex and it's changing fast. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
It really is. So to sum it all up, what are the key things our listeners should remember about all of this?
Okay, big picture. Those tariffs on China, those were a huge escalation. The 90-day pause for everyone else, that gave some breathing room, but that 10% baseline tariff, that's still out there. In Taiwan, semiconductors are okay for now, but other industries are facing some real challenges. And for investors, diversify, stay informed, and don't be afraid to ask for help.
Good advice. It's all about staying informed and adapting to the new reality.
Exactly.
Before we go, I want to leave you with something to think about. All of these changes, those tariffs, those reactions, they're not just about trade, they're about something bigger. They're forcing countries to rethink how they do business, where they get their supplies, how they develop technology. Maybe this whole thing, it's a wake-up call, pushing everyone towards more localized supply chains, more self-reliance, especially when it comes to tech. And where does Taiwan fit in all of this? They're a powerhouse in semiconductors, a key player in the global tech scene. So what role will they play in this new landscape? It's something to think about, something that goes beyond the day-to-day headlines. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you there.